This week, Tariq and I are back to argue across the generational divide about the best and worst space science fiction on television ever. Tops of the list, For All Mankind, and of course, Star Trek. But the worst? Anyone ever seen Starlost or Lost in Space? How about Rocky Jones Space Ranger? Before you poke a pencil in your eye to avoid seeing more, you better listen to this indispensable guide for everything space on TV.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 16, recorded June 17th, 2022. The best and worst space shows on TV. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Space TV Show edition. Yes, we're going to chat about all those TV shows we've been watching with space and science fiction themes. The good, the bad, and the downright embarrassing. And you Radar Men from the Moon fans know what I'm talking about. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, and I'm joined, as always, by Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief of Space.com, the premier space news website. Hello, Tariq.
I'm doing well. Glad to be here, beaming in just for this special episode of Space TV. Well, or as I like to call it at Space.com, just TV, right? So it's all
said.
Space. Wow. I get the crickets.
Sure. You get the crickets today. All right. We have a lot of territory to cover, but first, let's split a gut. So, appropriate to the subject, here we go. A stormtrooper walks into a bar. The stormtrooper shoots the red shirt but misses every shot, and the red shirt dies anyway. That's the punchline, in case nobody realized that. Okay.
I like that we got Star Wars and Star Trek in the same genre.
Yeah. So, or I'm a guy who's into Star Wars, Star Trek, and Doctor Who. Can you guess what I'm not into right now? Relationships. All right.
It's funny because it's true. So.
As I could say firsthand. So we have some interesting a couple of bits of SpaceX news this week, but primarily they're a step closer to full clearance from the Federal Aviation Administration, which has been hanging up their operations down at Boca Chica with an environmental review, a needed environmental review, I might add. The site down there, Starbase, where they test their suborbital Starship flights, was originally cleared for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, and then they started flying this much larger, potentially much more dangerous spacecraft out of there. So the FAA said, okay, we got to do a new review. That's been going on for a better part of a year. Was open to public comment. They get 18,000 comments, pro and con. But they now have a provisional, I wouldn't call it a clearance, but a provisional nod from the FAA, assuming they work out 75 separate specific issues.
You know what, my pal and colleague Mike Wall over at Space.com, he's been following this for a long time, and you know that's the big question has been when is SpaceX going to launch their Starship from Starbase? And you're right. You know, when SpaceX first broke ground on this facility in the deep south of Texas, like the very tip of Texas, they said they were going to launch Falcon Heavy rockets from there and maybe some Falcon 9s. And they've really scaled up what they want to do with this giant, mega, biggest rocket on the planet, basically. It's bigger than the Saturn V. And so this has been something that's been kind of hovering over SpaceX for the most part of this year. They've been waiting for this clearance from the FAA to finish this environmental review. It's been going on forever. And so much so that in February, Elon Musk said that they're even going to start building Starship in Florida on the off chance they don't get this. Now, they did get kind of this, like you mentioned, an earlier provisional nod saying, okay, we've taken a look at it and it seems like it's all right for this new use of your launch site as long as you do a few things here. The Sierra Club also filed a big protest against SpaceX and the FAA because there's only one road. I've been out to this facility and there is one road that goes there. In fact, there's a border checkpoint that you have to go through before you get to the Starbase facility. And then
a U.S. border checkpoint?
Yeah, between U.S. and Mexico, because they just want to make sure that they know who's getting. It's literally a stone's throw from the border. Not literally, but it's very close. But it ends in this really nice beach that's it feels a little secluded because it ends and then there's a little cove there, but it's just a really pretty area. And the beach is, it's a nice beach for the people that live nearby to enjoy. There's some local tribes that have attachments to it too. And they're saying that when SpaceX launches or does their tests, they block access for a long time before and after their tests. So now part of that is they can't do it on the weekends. Or they're limited to like a weekend a month, that sort of a thing.
Yeah, 5 a year.
To make sure that there is access. So there's a lot of things like that SpaceX has to do to be a good neighbor. And in the meantime, over the last few years, they've been slowly buying out people that live in Boca Chica Village. It's a little village nearby where most of the risk is posed to those folks that live there. When they have an accident, it could blow out windows, a rocket could fall on it, if it goes too far off course. So that's what we see now, is that they've got this kind of early nod from the FAA. These corrective actions aren't too serious. It's things like making sure that they're tracking all of their stuff real well, that they've got this beach closure thing sorted, that they've got their hazardous chemicals and all of that all set. They still need to get launch approval for a rocket to go to orbit for this flight. That is not a low hurdle to get to, but they've done that in the past from here. So we think that they would most likely do it. And for this first flight of Starship, they're not going to land anywhere. They're going to launch Starship up and they're going to dump everything out to sea for the most part. So they just want to show that they can get up into orbit. I think they're going to splash down off of Kauai, the actual vehicle itself, when they're done. So it's a step closer. Is it a big step? I think that remains to be seen, because SpaceX still has to do static fires with this booster. They haven't flown the super heavy booster yet. So there's a lot of other factors before we can say they're ready to fly. Elon Musk, meanwhile, after this approval came through, did say July they could launch into orbit and then try to launch again with a different vehicle in August. I'm going to say let's wait and see, because there's already been a lot of delays. But if he's saying that now, then probably in the shorter time as opposed to later, we're going to see these vehicles actually get off the ground.
And we do have a little addendum to this story. There was another bit of news that came out yesterday about SpaceX, an open letter from the employees protesting, I guess is the right word, some of Elon's behavior in the public sphere and some of the work practices at SpaceX. And it was signed by a lot of employees, some anonymously, some on record. And this is a very young story, so there's still a lot of detail to come out about it. But I guess what you saw came off of Reuters, right? The main story we just talked about is on space.com, but the one I'm talking about now is on Reuters and a couple of other sites.
That's right. Reuters and New York Times are reporting that. So yesterday there was this open letter that is said to have been circulated by employees at SpaceX complaining about Elon Musk's behavior, that it's an embarrassment to the company, et cetera. He is known for being a bit provocative on Twitter. There's been a lot of back and forth at Tesla, his electric car company, and SpaceX also about work from home rules, things like that, issues that came up during the pandemic. And so the kind of active part of the story is that, according to Reuters and New York Times, 5 people related to that open letter are said to have been fired. Again, it's all still brand new, and we haven't verified any of it ourselves. But it's something just to watch, because it is a symbol of maybe some internal turmoil that's going on with the workforce there. And it is something that could affect their production. It can affect their flights, all of that, because it involves staff and whatnot. So, just something to keep an eye on going into the weekend.
Okay. Next up, we have ET phoning home, ? Rumors spread last week of the Chinese Fast Radio Telescope, which at this point is the largest in the world, is built in the Natural Depression. This is another space.com story, receiving possible indications of alien radio transmissions. But most people watching this story that know what they're talking about feel this is probably some kind of Earth-based interference. And we do have reason to think that. It was years ago. I think it was a Russian radio telescope that had picked up what they thought, it might have been domestic here in the U.S., picked up what they thought could possibly be some kind of incoming messagey looking thing from another star system, and it turned out to be somebody running a microwave down the hall. So these things are kind of hard to tease out, but have you seen any updates on this story?
Well, I've been waiting for ET to phone home since, I guess for 40 years, right? It's the 40th anniversary this year of ET. But no, Leonard David, the writer for this story for space.com, he actually found this on his own. He's our Space Insider columnist, and it's interesting. It's like every now and then you hear, it's like the asteroid Apophis. Every now and then you hear that someone has found aliens, but it's always never aliens. And when we saw this report come out of China, actually, that from some scientists that said that they had got this weird signal, they think it could be alien in nature. Like, number one reaction is always, it's not aliens, because it's never aliens. It's always something else. Still, the Fast Radio Telescope, that's short for 500 meter aperture spherical radio telescope. It is the largest on the planet. It was bigger than Arecibo when we still had an Arecibo in Puerto Rico. They got this really weird signal. Some experts that Leonard spoke to, they all really, say this is interference. It's such a big signal. They haven't done the vetting for it. And even some of the reports from the science and technology departments there in China say that it's most likely going to be radio interference. So, always take it with a grain of salt. It's exciting to think about it when they get a new signal, but it's always something else. The WOW signal that SETI found way back when, it turns out to be benign as well. And some of them are just echoes of signals that we've sent out that we hear again. So it's a search that will be ongoing, and the better we listen, the more chances of interference from all the stuff that powers our daily lives. But still, a little tempest in a teapot about finding ET. It makes me wonder, though, Rod, what's going to happen when we actually do get a signal from ET and none of us believe it because we're like,
right,
whatever. So
the initially, while we're about to be invaded, it'll be dismissed as somebody popping popcorn down the hall.
That's right.
Just very quick one. SLS has been rolled back out. Space Launch System has been rolled back out to the launch pad for another wet dress rehearsal. And that's coming up this weekend, and all fingers crossed, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. Call the stations on Saturday as we're speaking right now. Call the stations on Saturday. That's if everything goes well, then on June 20th, today, that's a Monday, they will count down to 0 with the fueling. They fixed a leaky valve. They fixed a bunch of broken stuff. They've tightened bolts that were causing leaks. They think they've got it all. Again, we have to wait and see, because this is the 4th time they've been trying to do this, and it is a test they have to get done before they can try to launch in August. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, toes crossed. And finally, you've got some news about an upcoming planetary alignment you wanted to share.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows, as they're going into what is a holiday weekend in the United States, that if they get up real early in the morning, that's before dawn, they can see 5 bright visible planets with the unaided eye. That's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, making an arc across the eastern sky. And on June 23rd, so before we talk next, Rod, the moon is going to join that arc. So, in fact, it's going to be near Saturn this weekend. And so I just want to let people know, we haven't seen this in a couple of years, and it's just a nice little tidbit for summer. And the nice part about these planets is that they're all the brightest planets in the sky, which means you usually do not need telescopes or binoculars to go see them. You can see them just with your unaided eye, but you do have to get up before sunrise. So if you're an early bird, that's great. If not, probably worth getting up early for the weekend and then going back to sleep. But do check it out, because we don't see that many planets that close together all that often.
Well, we'll have to tune into Coast to Coast AM to see if we can hear some new UFO reports, because surely there will be some.
That's right.
Coming
That's right. Venus. It's always Venus or swamp gas.
It's always Venus. Venus chasing me over the horizon. All right. Well, it's time to talk about some of the best and worst space-themed TV shows, and now streaming series of all time. I just want to make a note, judging from the emails we got after the Best and Worst Movies episode, y'all out there in our wonderful, beloved audience had some feelings about that topic. I bet there'll be more after this episode, maybe even more because it's television. I have some thoughts. First, although we try, we can't please everyone, but we work very hard to do so because we love our listeners. Next, Tariq and I will surely overlook some of your favorites and perhaps run down some of your favorites. Usually that's my role. And, take it with a grain of salt. These are subjective opinions. But, feel free to write in with any thoughts about this episode. I hope they're civil, but you be you. I have a big bulging email bag of comments from you lovely people. And once we've gathered enough of your opinions, we'll revisit the topic and cross my heart and hope to whatever.
Be kind, I think is what Rod is saying.
Talk to you about some of these things. Yeah, because it's important. Because in my humble opinion, space science fiction is one of the cornerstones of our modern life. So it's important stuff. All right. So off to the wormhole races. I think when one's talking about space shows on television, how can you not start with Star Trek, right? I mean, it's the granddaddy of space science fiction. There were plenty of shows before that. We'll be mentioning a couple, but that was really the big moment when that show debuted in 1966, because it was the first, arguably the first really serious attempt at trying to look at this. It wasn't a silly space fantasy or a soap opera. It was a show that was really trying to look at what space travel and human society might look like in a couple of centuries. And, despite the fluorescent velour costumes and so forth, it was one of the first shows to try and represent a diverse population in terms of the actors that they chose, men and women both. It was one of the first shows that really tried to look at social issues. And of course, they had advantage, which is they could use all these analogies and allegories in the future to look at issues of superpower competition with, us versus the Klingons and so forth, civil rights issues that were happening in the U.S. at the time. So Gene Roddenberry, who was the creator, was very aware of all this. And although he pitched it to the networks as, quote, wagon train to the stars, unquote, it was really a lot more than that. It was the original space opera with a lot of morality play material within. So Roddenberry himself had been a bomber pilot in World War II. He had been an officer in the Los Angeles Police Department. He had written for a number of TV shows before that, and he had produced one that I know of called The Lieutenant. And he pitched Star Trek to MGM, who passed on it, but was eventually brought in not for that show, but to do various other projects by Desilu, which was Lucille Ball's production company, which is a pretty brave move on their part because this was really something brand new. So Desilu took the pilot to CBS, who said, no thanks, we already have a space show, which turned out to be the far less impressive Lost in Space. That was their mistake. And it went to NBC instead. So they created a pilot. NBC wasn't crazy about it. They created another pilot, and off they went. So, of course, this is the original Star Trek. When you talk about Star Trek, you have to talk about the whole phenomenon. It's not just one show. It's been, I don't know what now, 9 or 10 across half a century. So it's, as far as I know, the longest lived series, franchise that is, in the history of television.
I would say franchise because if the BBC, Rod, would be a little annoyed if you don't give Doctor Who its credit as the longest running science fiction
I should have
channel.
said space show, yeah, because
September 8th,
arguably not a space show.
Well, time and space, but September 8th, 1966. That's when the original Kirk episode of a run of Star Trek began. And the reason I say that is because just like Rod said, the very first episode, which was where no one has gone before, is that right? That was
the second
Pike.
pilot. The first pilot was the Pike episode, the menagerie,
cage,
where no man goes before was the people with the glowy eyes. Yeah,
that's right. So, oh yeah. So, I mean, you can't see it right now because I've got my green screen on, but I've got this Star Trek chair. I'm a huge fan. I discovered Star Trek when I was a kid, and my cousins were watching some horror movie, probably Warning Sign. where people turn into zombies from a Monsanto-esque corporation. And I got so scared that I went and watched an episode of Star Trek on like a TNT rebroadcast on a black and white TV. It was amazing, and it changed my life forever, and led me to my current trajectory. But so I have a lot of love for Star Trek. All of the Star Treks, even Enterprise, I think it has its place, and it even has NASA astronauts to make cameos and all of that there. And so yeah, I mean, I think Star Trek is the show that I run into the most in talking to astronauts about what they watch and what inspired them, and it's nice to see a lot of that come full circle, where astronauts have cameoed on Star Trek in many different series. The Next Generation, Mae Jemison was in an episode of that, and then to your point about them recasting and reshaping the show, right now on Paramount Plus, which is going through a whole Star Trek renaissance, they've given an entire series to the plot line of that first episode that was shelved for being too cerebral, by having the whole original kind of crew lineup, different actors, of course, playing them. But that's what the whole plot of Strange New Worlds is this time before Captain Kirk was ever captain of the Enterprise. And it is one of the best new shows they've ever made of Star Trek. So I really cannot say enough about that show. It's amazing.
Well, we'll talk about that and more of these spinoffs right after we take this short break. All right, so if you're a boomer, which I am very much one, although I'm right at the tail end of it, thank God. Of course, the original series is what you remember because we saw that during our formative years. And as I already said, it was kind of a transformational thing. This was not what you were seeing on TV. And I still remember arguing with my sister, who was 5 years older, about wanting to watch Lost in Space instead of Star Trek, and she just wasn't having any of it. And looking back on it today, I understand why. But there's been a lot of Star Trek since the original series. We, of course, followed that up with the motion picture in 1978, 79. And then The Next Generation started in the 80s. And it was an attempt to update the show, make it a little more, I can't say socially responsible, but a little more in tune with the times. And, we still had all these fluorescent, the interior of the Enterprise was mauve. And of course, like we're going to see in almost all the shows we talk about, there was still some scientific improbabilities like, push button gravity, for instance, where you just push a button and everybody sticks to the floor. But it was a big step forward. That was followed by Deep Space Nine, which, disclaimer, I worked on for a few seasons in the effects department. The last show, by the way, in Star Trek where we use physical models. After that, it was all computer graphics. And Enterprise was a big move forward in those computer graphics. And I have to say, it took me years to get around to watching Enterprise, but
I like how you skipped over Voyager, like right there. Just you completely went from DS9 to Enterprise.
Yeah, that's the issues with Voyager.
I like Voyager.
Voyager has its adherents, but the thing I was going to say about Enterprise is because they really moved aggressively into CGI for that show, you could tell the stories in a more compelling way. Because like Babylon 5, which we're also going to discuss, you had these visual effects sequences that didn't require 7 or 8 camera passes past a miniature Enterprise and very expensive compositing and an edit bay and so forth that we had to do on Deep Space Nine. Now you had CGI, so instead of a 10-second effect shot and then cutting back to 30 seconds of a captain bouncing in his chair saying fire all phasers and all that, you're able to really show more. And because you're not physically shooting it, if you want 23 ships in the frame doing a huge battle, it's just a little more time in the computer box. Aligning this stuff, you don't have to shoot, because it got to the point on, well, at least on Deep Space and the very end of Next Gen, battle sequences push the ratings up so high they become sort of the model du jour that we were supposed to do. And it got to the point where it was so expensive, I was actually making trips down to the Hallmark store to buy Star Trek ornaments, Christmas ornaments that we'd stick up in the background just to have all these other ships in the shot. And, it's kind of a weird way to do business. It worked, but CGI was your friend. So I thought one thing that the Enterprise really got right was being able to tell more in-depth stories a little more smoothly by being able to do those effect sequences properly. Is that something you noticed?
No, I mean, I remember collecting the TV guide where they talked about the Enterprise NX-01 being I still have all those TV guides with all the Star Trek top stories in them, but they talk about being the first one they've ever designed totally in CG for it. So being really excited, getting the fold out cutaway models of them all. I feel like we could spend an entire episode just talking about Star Trek, by the way, because we're on Enterprise now, and there's already, what is there? There's Discovery and Picard and Strange New Worlds, which we were just talking about earlier.
And Voyager.
And Lower Decks, which is an animated show, plus the other original animated show. So I think that's more than 10 TV shows now. And of course, there've been like a whole movie reboot. So
yeah, so you're right. It really is kind of an episode of its own. But suffice to say, so strong points of this show. The strong points I have are their morality-driven plot lines, which I think were really revolutionary. And as we talked about before on this podcast, among those things, one was the first interracial kiss on TV, where Kirk was, and they wrote it in a very crafty way. He's forced to kiss Lieutenant Uhura, like that would be difficult, by aliens who are forcing them to act out in an arena, sort of a gladiatorial arena. And they kind of cheated the shot a little bit because Shatner sort of turns his shoulder at the last minute, but you know what's going on. There's a bit of hue and cry. This was America in the mid-1960s after all. But it was a big moment and kind of a transformational moment in television and certainly in the show. And lots of other issues that they tackled that were very difficult for the time.
Well, that became their trope too, is taking issues of the day and then transcribing them into a sci-fi acceptable format,
right,
that then the mass public that watches the show would be able to identify with. And I think you're talking about the interracial kiss. There was the episode where people were black on one face and white on the other, right? Or they're just opposite. Face, that was the only thing, and they ended up
and they hated each other,
and they hated each other for it. And that all Star Trek VI, the Undiscovered Country, the best Star Trek movie of all time. All right, is about the
Wrath
end of the
Khan.
Cold. It's about no. Star Trek VI, and I will die on that hill, Red. So, but McCoy will save me. We all know that. But that's the end of the Cold War, is what that whole film is about, from 1992, when it was actually ending. It just happened. So very, very true to form. And I think we still see some of that, although in streaming, there's a lot more like one big plot that goes on, and it's hit or miss. But I think Strange New Worlds is really kind of getting back into that vibe of looking at an issue with an episodic take on Trek TV.
Well, the ignorance of your opinions is noted, and I'll just note that Burke on our technical staff agrees with me, but that's okay. We can agree to disagree.
He actually, I'm gonna spoil it. He actually said that my assertion that Star Trek VI is the best Star Trek movie of all time is barf. You are wrong. But I'm gonna give credit. I take the criticism.
Everybody's a critic, right?
I have.
Well, okay.
There's a summer where I watched that movie on tape every single day after summer school that I went to. Apparently,
you're admitting
for fun.
this in public.
So, yeah.
Wow.
And I ate on microwave.
I knew somebody who
pizza,
watched Dirty Dancing every day for a year, so I'll give you that. I think the one thing we can agree on that was a strong point was the continuity in the original Star Trek of Captain Kirk getting his shirt ripped every couple of episodes so we could see his not very impressive man packs, which was kind of, even as a kid, I remember thinking, this guy's a lunatic. And a bit of a ham. And I have to say, for the original show, that trio of Kirk, Spock, McCoy, it took a while for them to find their groove. First few episodes, Spock is constantly yelling things out very emotionally, which is kind of in conflict with his character. But that trio so balanced each other and so acted as these kind of, voices in sort of the Greek dramatic tradition that it really pushed it forward. And they've tried to reincarnate that sense with mixed success, but that ensemble acting was really something. Okay, weak points from the original series. Some of the sets were a bit wobbly. They were cool, but they could have been better. Visual effects from the original show were not the greatest, but of course this was in an era when that was all new. and they have since been redone digitally for the re-release, the original series, so it's entirely watchable now. The aforementioned push-button gravity, some weak science, and some real stinker episodes, of which Spock's brain has got to be at the top of the list. And my conclusion is probably the best set in space morality play ever. What's yours?
I like ships. I like that it's Horatio Hornblower in space, which was Gene Roddenberry's big concept. I like the effect that it had on pop culture and space exploration. NASA's first space shuttle was called the Enterprise. Virgin Galactic's first space plane was called the Enterprise because of Star Trek, and so I think there's a bit of a circular path that art has informed on real life space exploration, which then has fed back into a new generation, if you will, of Star Trek, where they're taking all the new tech that we actually have now and finding ways to reinterpret that in those shows too. And I love the ships. I love the ships. So.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because when working on the show, one of the things that people whined about was so-called bottle shows, which is where the whole thing was on the ship, and it's less expensive to shoot, but it's not as exciting. But personally, I always kind of enjoyed those the most. But we got to move on. Battlestar Galactica, which premiered in 1978, show by a gentleman named Glenn Larson. For those who saw the original series, it was very different than the reboot, which was in 2004, which I also worked on. The original show had the same plot line as the new one, at least the core plot line, which is this, group of people living in the space fleet searching for the home planet Earth and battling the evil Cylons. The original Cylons were big, clunky, chromy looking things with some serious disco lighting going on. They always had these magenta and light green filtered light sources on either side of them, bouncing off of their robot outfits and monotone voices, and a small stock of effect shots that they used over and over and over. But it was entertaining in its own sense. Lauren Green was the acting lead as Commander Admiral Adama. Was he an admiral in the original? I think so. And it had its redeeming qualities. Then it was rebooted in 2004. I was working on 2001, kind of doing the pre-visualization for the ships and so forth. And I really admired the reboot, and especially the effects work was a huge step forward. The guy in charge of that shop was a gentleman named Gary Hutzel, who I hired at a TV commercial company I was working at in the 80s. And he landed that gig after working on Next Generation and Deep Space Nine for years and years and years. And I thought that the effects for the reboot were really spectacular. The plots were a lot more complicated and far deeper. And I think if there's a word that covers it, it's gritty. And I stuck with the show until Commander Tariq had to kill his wife for being a Cylon spy. And it kind of lost me there. I don't know. Did you? You stuck with the whole thing though, right?
Yeah, I watched it all the way to the end. And I actually had a similar moment. There's a character named Callie who was just a female engineer on the show, and she has a relationship with one of the star engineers, and it's a very similar experience where she finds out that the big spoiler alert that some of the characters are Cylons, and they end up spacing her, and it's really, really sad, and that's when that they're good, that nobody is safe, and at a time when a lot of the shows you didn't get a lot of that. I think Lost was another sci-fi show where you didn't know who was going to survive from episode to episode.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure the writers knew from what I saw of that show. It's kind of like they're really pitching it week to week.
What I liked about that show, though, is that about the reboot is that there is more of a world on the different ships. So there's like a ship that just makes all the stuff, all the engineering stuff that the other ships need to rely on. And they did explore a lot of the politics of that. And in the final seasons, they got really out there with like who's a Cylon, what the mythology is like. I guess there's like a religion that came into play that it got really hard to follow. And there's a whole season where they end up on a planet, working for under the Cylon oppression that I just really did not enjoy. But in terms of reboots, it did its job to get a whole new generation of sci-fi fans excited about a show. It did spawn some spin-offs. And in fact, as we were talking about Star Trek, there were astronauts that really got into the show. And I'm thinking about Garrett Reisman, who was Colonial Marine number 3 in the finale. I did get to talk to him after that. And he was hoping that he would, I think he ends up getting killed, but he was really hoping to see his death on screen. I'm not sure that we see it at all, but he's in there. He's in there somewhere, just like Mike Fink is in the last episode of Enterprise, along with Terry Virts. So just another astronaut cameo in a sci-fi show to think about.
So strong points, far grittier plot lines, vastly improved visual effects, arguably larger story elements, better acting, I think, and of course the timeless return to the homeland theme. Weak points,
weak points,
plot lines.
Got
dark.
Got too dark. Got way out there. Did not have a satisfying resolution. Did not enjoy the finale at all. And so with the exception of the original Battlestar theme song playing as the fleet heads into the sun at the end, that was a nice tribute to the original show.
Yeah, it was well done. All right, moving on to The Expanse, because you got to talk about The Expanse. And I guess my kind of overarching statement is what's not to love. We start with a gumshoe detective season, which I had a little trouble getting into, but it turned out to be quite good. Lots of military action, which everybody loves. Space battles, which everybody loves. Romance, which most of us love. Wormholes, tough, capable women, and very realistic spaceships with an observation of the laws of physics, which is kind of a rare thing in television. I
got to ask, did you ever read the books?
Bit of it.
Did you read the books that The Expanse are based on?
Halfway through them, and I did enjoy them, but in a rare twist, I enjoyed the show more than I enjoyed the books. How about you?
I could say that's fair. That's fair. I kind of had the reverse. I read the books first, and then the show came out, and had the opportunity to go to Sci-Fi Channel events and meet the cast and whatnot. That was really, really exciting. So they kind of exist in two different universes, because the books go super, super deep, and there's like a 20-year time jump in the middle where you really fall in love with the characters. And the show is, very compact and very neat, where they're telling a certain aspect of some of the arcs we see in the book series. But you are right. If you are looking for the most realistic depiction of super sci-fi space opera, you don't go wrong with The Expanse. And so much so that when Sci-Fi did let it go, because it was originally on Sci-Fi Channel, Jeff Bezos picked it up. He just announced that they were going to do the last few seasons on Prime.
And do you remember where he did that?
He did that at the ISDC conference. Is that correct?
The National Space Society's ISDC conference, and we had an inkling, but we didn't know what the announcement was going to be. And the 5 of the lead characters and the showrunner and executive producers were sitting at a table down front, and Bezos made this announcement, and the room went nuts, and it was the best PR we had gotten in about 40 years for that conference. So it was cool to see, because people were really, really emotional, and you could tell that Bezos was quite charged up about it.
This is a universe where humanity has expanded not to the stars like in Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica, but just across the solar system. And I think it really highlights that the solar system is a big place that we live in. And you've got people you've got a united Earth under the United Nations, but it's all, subsumed with global warming, which we're seeing now, sadly. There's people living on the moon. Mars is a whole breakaway group, the asteroid belt, where people, their bodies are fundamentally changed. They can't live under Earth gravity because they're so attuned to a lighter gravitational
they evolved for it,
exactly. And you've got these different cultures that have arisen over time, and the ships are all old. A lot of them are hundreds of years old, because they just maintain them over time because they're so expensive to make. And that is so close to what we're seeing now with the International Space Station pushing its third decade because it's so expensive to make. So you want to get the most out of it. And you know that if NASA had been able to make their space shuttles a bit safer and did not have 2 fatal accidents, they would be flying those today. I went to those shuttle life extension conferences where they were talking about 2030s and whatever. So there's a lot of realism that comes with it. And then you add to that a multi-planet corporation mystery story, a whodunit, and over time a war in space where asteroids are used as weapons. I don't think I'm spoiling anything because the show's over on Prime. You can binge watch the entire series right now. But it is just
don't forget the evil goo.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, there's
Gotta have
a
the evil goo in there.
A proto-molecule. There's like illegal scientific experimentation, colonies on moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and then portals that go to who knows how many planets way back out across the solar system. So now they do stop short. I will say this one big spoiler if you like the books. The TV series does not go all the way through the book series because there's like 8 books, not with a lot of spin-offs. So they tell a much more truncated version of that story, but it's still a really good ride.
Yeah, I got to agree. And I have to say, though, even more than Battlestar Galactica, this was kind of the ultimate pushback on the Star Trek universe of this is not a Love, Peace, and Bobby Sherman utopia. This is people carrying all their worst traits off into space and acting them out there once again. And there is a little bit of optimism towards the end of the series, but it's tough. You watch that and you see the worst behavior we're used to. So strong points, as you point out, the series was based on a series of very well-written books, strong plot lines with a lot of subplots that went throughout multiple seasons. You could get lost if you missed too many episodes. Truly great visuals, strong characters. Who doesn't love Amos? He's a stone-cold killer with a heart.
The actors for Amos,
yeah.
and the Captain Holden, by the way, auditioned for the each other's parts. So the actor that ended up as Holden was trying to be Amos, and the one that ended up being Amos was trying to be Holden, but secretly wanted the Amos part. And so it's interesting that they ended up where they were.
Boy, could you imagine? I mean, that a favorite pastime many people is alternative casting outcomes for various shows and movies. That would not have been a good one. And in my weak points, first season was a tough slog for a lot of people, but if you got through it, it was well worthwhile. And
I would say that another weak point is the fact that when the shift between the Sci-Fi series arcs and the Prime arcs are very abrupt, and you can tell because there are fewer episodes on Prime. So the arcs get faster. They drop a lot of details from the books. If you really love the books, you're going to have a harder time with those later seasons because they really, really streamline everything to tell a shorter and smaller story.
And if I may, and I'm going to get pilloried for this, but my final weak point is I got so tired of the pouty face on James Holden. I just wanted to stick a chopstick in my right eye after a while. He'd stumble around the lounge looking sad with his pouty lips. And I just thought, get over yourself, okay? You're supposed to be the big hero in the solar system. Stop pouting and whining and get on with it. But conclusion, I think we can agree it's probably one of the best written and best produced space operas to date. And I would classify it as a very sophisticated space opera.
Yeah.
We will be back after this short break.
We've got so many other shows to talk about.
Yeah, let's fly through a couple more because we got to get to the icky stuff. Babylon 5, big fan favorite, came out in 1994. It's, like Firefly, it had a really rabid fan base. It was kind of, I think the general consensus, at least, and this was while I was working on Star Trek, so of course we had our opinions, which were probably very unfair. It had a great theme, this post-war society trying to live in peace, and this station that's kind of a diplomatic meeting point. A lot of relevance to contemporary problems on Earth. I think where we sort of bagged on it, and unfairly in retrospect, because I looked at it again the other day and it was better than I remembered. And sorry, I'm getting a little techie here, but they were one of the first sci-fi shows to do their effects in CGI. I think The Last Starfighter, the movie, had come out before that, and that was famously high-end CGI for the time. Babylon 5 did their effects on an Amiga 4000 computer with composite video output, and we, of course, all sneered, composite, we're shooting on 35 millimeter. But again, it allowed them to tell really sophisticated stories with some very big, deep story arcs that were supported by what for the time were smeary, although really sophisticated visual effects. And they had a creative team that really strove to elevate storytelling beyond their budgetary limitations. And you can actually see, I think, kind of hints of what are coming in shows like The Expanse in that series. Some great design elements, really creative use of darkness and visual effects that we hadn't seen before. And that's about as good as TV got at the time. Were you a fan?
I was. And in the beginning, I kind of scoffed at it. Oh, it's a knockoff Star Trek, whatever. And then I stumbled across a forum, because that's how we got the internet back then, where they were discussing how there was a 5-year arc that Michael Straczynski, the writer for the show, had envisioned. And then when I knew there was a big master plan for how it was going to play out, I really, really got into it. Loved the physics of their fighters. In fact, we had a model one at space.com for a long time. And then, just my one gripe was always that they would say the name of the place and not just the name Babylon 5 in the opening credits. And for whatever reason, that would always grind my gears. And every season I hoped they would take it out, and every season it was still in there. So
yeah, and so I guess just to kind of in conclusion, I mean, it deserves more conversation, but as I said, I went back and looked at a number of episodes the other day and was kind of struck by how truly creative the visuals were. And I'm not running down the plot lines at all. I mean, I think they're very good.
I think it's on Prime right now. If people want to watch it, it's definitely worth, because I started a rewatch just recently, and I got about halfway through the first season before a bunch of other new shows came out that I really wanted to see. And it unlike some of the other shows, it does hold up. I mean, you buy into the universe that that's what their tech looks like, and it doesn't feel like something from the late 90s, etc. It feels like, it's of itself, and the stories all mesh together. So I think it still holds up. So
I have a lot of respect for it. On the other hand, and I better duck when I say this, but Firefly. Now, a lot of people really love Firefly. It was too short, at least the original series. Joss Whedon was the creator. There's a lot of good stuff in the ideas behind it, but it was an obvious space western, right down to the 6-shooters and the lounge area of the spacecraft that looks like something from Little House on the Prairie. Didn't watch it when it came out. Watched some of it later. I think I get what people like about it. It just didn't really do it for me. But the kind of theme of little people, the anonymous under the boot heel of history, watching things happen around them. These buccaneers, privateers trying to survive in a hostile galaxy, this post-war environment. It was true space opera, and I guess that's a legacy. But I mean, you can't deny the fan base. I mean, they did a movie after the series ended. They've had spin-off comic books.
The audience cheered in that movie theater when I went to go see it. So
did they?
And and a major character, and this is, again, it might be spoiling it for people who have never seen these shows, but a major character dies, beloved character, and my then girlfriend, now partner, turned to me and said they killed him, and I was like, I know, right? So, but
it's kind of like watching Star Trek 2 when Spock died. You sort of felt violated, huh? Yeah,
well, no, they got to make another one so they can bring him back. I have a whole theory where they make another one where he has a twin brother and he comes back and it's all fine again. But no, I am one of the pro Firefly people. I collect the comics, I read the books. It's a really rich universe that I really get. Although it is the whole, we lost the war against the hegemony and we're just trying to get by, and maybe we'll thumb our nose at authority when we can, but we just want to be left alone for the most part. It's another one where the ships are really nice and the ships have different philosophies to them. There's on the cons, I would say that there's a bit of culture swiping in that show where they use Chinese a lot and characters just because it's cool, not because it has a really good reason. And so, if there's things like that don't really play all that well. And of course, it was from Joss Whedon, who is not as shiny, as the show would say, as he was at that time as a TV golden boy.
Right.
And there's a whole backstory about Firefly and how it was on Fox, and Fox didn't like the order the episodes were on. They only showed a few of the episodes. I remember looking for Firefly on TV, trying to find it the week after I saw my second episode, and they had like changed the time slot, and I never saw it again on TV until it came out again on DVD, and it drove me nuts. And that was just another thing that really, I think, added to the cult status of it, is that they really got this short shrift in the beginning from a network, and it just made the fans want it that much more later on.
Well, if you like a Wild West libertarian lifestyle, you'll probably love Firefly. And for those people who do, there's a reboot being planned. So there you go. I think it's going to be a feature, but we'll see.
Really?
One thing I did note.
I got to look at it.
Yeah. One thing I did note that they did was they experimented a bit with Space is Quiet, which is if you're seeing a big explosion or an effect in space, usually you throw in sound effects because that's what we're all used to. But I did see a few shots in there where they said, no, we're just going to let it be silent. And that was courageous, because that hadn't been done much at that point. We got a lot more on the good side. I think a couple of these, For All Mankind, which is now in its new season.
Third season, going to Mars. Really
remarkable
exciting
show. This is Ron Moore's of Star Trek and other science fiction fame. Big moment. And the core of the show is this revisionist history of the space race moving forward. So the Soviet Union beats America to the moon, and everything kind of diverges from reality then. I was a little miffed when they killed Werner von Braun early in the first season with an exploding Saturn V, his greatest creation. But it's a very much a product of that time, in that there is this constant and unending tension with the Soviet Union, which stays the Soviet Union well past the date that they collapsed. It's also interesting to watch, because it's an alternative future. Of course, it's very easy to it's a bit like diverting an asteroid. It continues to diverge from reality to the point that they're, spoiler alert, now heading off to Mars, both on the private corporate side and as government programs of both Soviet Union and the United States. That's exciting. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. I would say one thing that's kind of a weak point for me is there's a little more soap opera in there that I preferred. There's a lot of hand-wringing, usually wives on the ground, sometimes husbands. They did open it up that way. But there's a lot of hand-wringing and what they're going through and illicit affairs and that kind of thing. And personally, I could do a little less of that. I'm more interested in what's happening in space and out in these other places, because that's why I'm watching it. But it's a very well-constructed show. Do you like it?
Yeah, and Ron D. Moore of Star Trek Legacy is and Battlestar Galactica actually is kind of the mastermind for this show. And what I like about it is that we're in the third season now, and each season is about a generation, so they're separated by about 20 years. So now we're in the 90s, and Bill Clinton is running against a Hart, I think, for president. Actually, no, one of the early characters from introducing the very first season is now running for president.
One of the astronauts,
yeah, one of the astronauts, and she has a great backstory too that they explore. And what I really like seeing is kind of where we could have been if they had kept that push, that competition going forward.
Yes.
Because now they're trying to go to Mars. They had things like the Sea Dragon, a massive rocket launched out of the ocean, what became a mainstay in the series, nuclear-powered space shuttles, things that were all on the drawing board at one point in time, but got nixed because of budget, because no one wanted to pay for them. They see that because of all of the competition that they've got going on with the Soviet Union, with private corporations, which is fairly new to the show, but we see it now in reality. And we're just talking about SpaceX and Elon Musk. They're going to Mars. It's the Helios company in For All Mankind. And
I would just add kind of a brilliant reinterpretation of who and what Elon Musk is, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that we should point out this is streaming service only, like The Expanse is on Prime, For All Mankind is on Apple TV Plus. So you do have to have that subscription in order to see the show. But if you do have it, it is worth checking out to see a lot of art imitating life, now imitating art, where we're kind of at the adversary level again with Russia. right now, and of course what's going on in Ukraine, it is telling a story that is very of its time right now, and then also for the folks that went through the 90s, what we could have been doing at that point in time if there was some kind of impetus to do so.
And you do bring up an excellent point, which is just to put a little bit more of a focus on it. This show demonstrates what could have happened had we continued using the Apollo hardware developed in the 1960s to get to the moon in a logical progression forward. So a lot of historians look back at Apollo and say, well, it was a closed-end system. It was just enough to get to the moon and do what we wanted to do there. And I'm talking about the Saturn V and the command module, lunar module, and so forth. But technologically, it was a fairly robust system, with the lunar module being kind of ironically the most reliable but probably weakest element in terms of possible failure modes, just because it was so lightly built. But it all performed brilliantly, and had that continued in use for another decade or so, we could have really done amazing things. And of course, there are plans, we've discussed it before, there are plans for a lunar base, there is plans for reusable Saturn V first stage, there are plans for crewed flights around Venus and Mars, not landing with the Apollo system, but flying out and looping those planets and coming back. So there's a lot of extended plans in the Apollo Applications Office in the 1960s for how to continue using that hardware. But in the mid to late 60s, we stopped building Saturn Vs, and by 1972, other than Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz test project, we were done with using that hardware. And it's unfortunate, because you can really see from this show, which I think is based in pretty sound logic and technological evaluation, what could have happened if we continued forward with that hardware base.
And I will give this one spoiler for it. In the very first episode, they start talking about testing the Nerva nuclear engine. We've talked about that engine on the show, right, Rod, about how it had a lot of promise to open up the solar system. And this is a focal point of one of the plot points in this show, is they need this engine to get to Mars. And so the private company is building a methane engine. We've heard that before too, because that's right, what Starship, SpaceX's big giant mega rocket, will be using. And so there is that circular logic going around right now, where they're really just interpreting where we could have been at a certain point in time. Now, society is different now. I think we're still a little bit more progressive than they are in the show as a society overall. But we'll have to wait and see how this latest season develops, because there's a lot of weird stuff going on as these three different teams are trying to get to Mars.
All right, so let's pivot to the icky shows, because this is they're kind of more fun to talk about. I think a nice straddler between good and bad is Lost in Space, the original. I'm not going to talk about the reboot quite as much, because I haven't seen enough of it to be particularly critical. But the original show premiered in 1965. It was CBS's acquisition that got them to decide not to take Star Trek, much to their chagrin, I'm sure. This was produced by Irwin Allen, who had done Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and famously reused a number of his props and monsters from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Lost in Space. And it was intended, if you've seen the original show at all, if you watch the first pilot, it was intended as serious science fiction. There was no Dr. Smith. There was no silliness in the first pilot. It was the Space Family Robinson going off to Alpha Centauri with their robot and their spaceship. And it wasn't as cool as Star Trek. It wasn't as deep as Star Trek, but it was interesting, although a little dull, because it was very saccharine. And one thing that says it all is the announcer, as the Jupiter 2 is taking off in the first pilot, talking about the daughter, Judy, who's giving up her promising acting career to be a space-dwelling person. I thought, oh boy, is this the mid-60s or what? Then they reshot it at CBS's request and added Dr. Smith, who was a very creepy bad guy in the pilot. And then as the series went on, got sillier and sillier, and they really pivoted towards kids. Again, these fluorescent velour costumes. By the way, the original series was set in 1997. That's when we were going to send our first family out to Alpha Centauri. Had a very cool robot, which is a cool thing. There's some legal shuffles going on behind the scenes with some people that have worked. There was a comic book series that actually was out before the movie called Space Family Robinson, so there was a legal struggle there. But it did move forward for a number of seasons. First season was black and white, went to kind of eye-numbing color thereafter. For me, strong points, robot the Jupiter 2 was a cool spaceship for something that early and kind of different. And the first season, they had a drivable craft called the Chariot.
The Chariot, that's right. And they had a pod too they could fly around in.
Always desert locations because it was in the studio radius of Los Angeles of 30 miles. And that was very cool. And then after that, they stopped shooting location and went to sound stages, and everything got pretty silly. Weak points, special effects were miserable. It's the only time I've ever seen crumpled up tinfoil used as asteroids. Dr. Smith turned into kind of a sniveling comic character, which was the actor's decision, Jonathan Harris, largely. Really emphasized Will Robinson, the youngest kid, because that was the audience they decided to go after. Really silly scripts and the Carrot Man, and I met years later, I met one of the directors from the show, and I may have related the story before, but I had a chance to sit down and chat with him, and I said, why would you do this? Why did you direct the show? He said, it's simple, my son, alimony. But he did confirm to me that the scripts were often structured around either leftover props from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which was Irwin Allen's other show, or literally from stuff they found dumpster diving on the lot. They would go around the lot looking to see what the prop departments were tossing out or what they weren't going to use anymore. And if they found something cool, like in one episode, the aliens wore capes and white glitter-covered top hats with stockings pulled over their faces because somebody had tossed out some wardrobe. So that's probably not the way to do the best stuff. But interestingly, the Jupiter 2's interior was at the time the most expensive set in television at $350,000.
Yeah.
Now, have you seen any of it? You're not.
Yeah, I was. So Lost in Space was in syndication when I was growing up, and so we could watch it after school. And I would get excited because the opening credits were always a cartoon, and I would think every time that I'm going to watch a cartoon of a family in space, and then it ends up not being a cartoon. But it was a lot of fun. I loved the Doctor and the robot. And all the hijinks that they would have with Will Robinson, and then there'd be all this other stuff going on with like the dad and the mom and Judy and the pilot. I would say
Don,
that
the great
Don,
forgotten
that's right.
Don. Yeah,
that's right. Well, and we actually just had a big discussion in my family because the Lost in Space reboot on Netflix is much more enjoyable if you're into action. And it has a different, they're not the first family to go in space. They're a family helping colonize Alpha Centauri that it just ends up going awry, and getting lost in space. And my disappointment is that the robot in the Lost in Space that a lot of people are exposed to now on Netflix is very different than the robot that they were designed to have in the original show. And so it's a completely different tone to what Lost in Space is versus what its original material was. Because there's a difference between like Danger Will Robinson, a robot built to protect, to an alien robot, which is what it ends up being. And that's not a spoiler.
Right.
The show's been over for like almost a year. So, a lot of that episodic stuff was still there. You see the same sets over and over again with the ship. So they're living in the ship. And I really I got, into that kind of a thing. And it was on right after school when I had come home. So it was fun to kind of tune in and see like what they were up to this time. But I would like to see that alternate reality cartoon version that's just the cartoon from the opening credits there. But I became an Irwin Allen fan because of that, and then watched all of his disaster films. Land of the Giants, I think, was another one that I thought was really interesting, and I had a good time. And of course, Land of the Lost, which you didn't talk about, and that's not really space. They're not in space for that stuff. But Time Tunnel is another one. Yeah, a lot of good stuff.
Irwin Allen did a lot with cheap fireworks and sparklers. Time Tunnel being one of them.
Poseidon
All right,
Adventure?
let's go to what I think could arguably be the worst science fiction on television ever. A show that nobody saw called The Starlost. And it was the first major role that Keir Dullea, who played Bowman in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the movie, did on television. And he returned to science fiction in this low-budget stinker that debuted in 1973. Conceived, interestingly enough, by Harlan Ellison, who was a brilliant writer, but often sort of didn't translate well into television. And the core idea is it's a generational starship going to another star system that goes astray because of technical problems. They're traveling now well beyond the amount of time they're supposed to, and these different parts of the generational ship are divided actually into separate societies, some of whom don't know about each other. And a lot of people don't know they're on a spacecraft. They just think they're living on a small planet. It's sort of like, growing up in the Mall of the Americas or something. They've been cut off from each other for...
Star Trek did that show for The World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. So
yeah,
right. Sorry.
Well, and that was way better than this, and that wasn't my favorite. So they've been flying 800 years. Keir Delay starts to ask uncomfortable questions about who's running the show and so forth. And he comes from kind of an Amish-looking society, which is an interesting thing to have on a high-tech spaceship. And it was just miserable. It was shot on videotape. It looks like it was shot on videotape. Doug Trumbull was designing the visual effects that they were using. But at every turn, the scoring is horrible, age or era appropriate, kind of very bad rocks, almost disco kind of music. The video was smeary. The effects were bad. The acting is wooden. I mean, there's nothing. The core creative staff hated the show they were doing, and you can see why. I mean, it looks like an episode of General Hospital, and most of it was just people standing and talking to each other. And accordingly, it tops many of the worst sci-fi shows of all time lists. And the favorite word I saw to describe the show overall was dire. Have you ever seen any of it?
I have not. I have to admit that Rod has for our good listeners, has a whole list of the worst sci-fi TV shows ever, and I haven't seen most of them. And I had to add the two that are at the bottom of my list. And the big caveat for all of these is that when I was growing up watching the shows that I've got, I probably loved them. They were probably like the bee's knees for me. But I look back on them now and it's like, oh my God, it's just, I can't sit through another episode of this. And yet I know I went to try to rewatch a couple of these shows on a streaming service and whatnot. So no, I've not seen Starlost. I haven't seen actually, I think, any of the other ones, with maybe the exception of, we may talk about it, the Osiris Chronicles here. I think I may have seen one or two of those shows way back when.
Well, it was only a pilot.
Yeah.
Thank God.
So then maybe I didn't. Maybe not.
All right. But I mean, you mentioned stuff that you liked that you now have reflected on. So the 1979 Buck Rogers, I'm going to leave this one to you because I can barely talk about it without feeling nauseated.
Well, that's another one that I remember really loving it when it was on TV, because I watched all this in syndication probably really late at night when I shouldn't have been watching TV. But I remember it all in flashes. I remember the golden robot kid, and the fighter jets,
or Twiki, yeah.
and that they were always having these really wild adventures and whatnot, and that's what I remember from it. But I don't remember the actual plots, like what the show was about, because I think I was a little too young. Because the shows that I was really watching and got into were like Quantum Leap and whatnot, which we didn't even talk about here. But it's not really a space show.
No, it's not. But it was better.
So yeah,
it's way better.
So I just but you think about, and Buck Rogers, if memory serves, is based on a book as well.
Well, it's based on a comic strip from the 1920s.
Okay,
so it had been through a lot of iterations before this of various quality, but I'd have to say even the movie serials that were done for Saturday matinees back in the 30s and I think 40s, as lame as they were with the rockets going around with sparks falling out the back and so forth, were better than this show. The thing I remember about this show is a lot of big hair, that god-awful robot who was voiced by Mel Blanc of Bugs Bunny fame, Twiki. I mean, this was a new low for Glenn Larson, once again of Battlestar Galactica fame. Came out, about the same time, but was so much worse than Galactica. I mean, between the hair, everybody's got lip gloss. Earth was ravaged by nuclear war in 1987. It's a shame the series wasn't burned down as well. And it was just... words fail me. It was just unwatchable. And I will add, I was quarantining on a boat for a few months during the pandemic, so I was stuck with over-the-air television, MeTV, And this came on after Star Trek on Saturdays, and it was with the ultimate of revulsion that I would start scrambling for the remote to turn it off before I had to listen to that serious voice narrator saying, you know, he was lost in space and came back on the 20, blah, blah, blah. It's just, okay. I think I've made my feelings clear.
Well, I just wanted to bring up, because there's some that I can't talk to. And one of the shows that it's either like a hate watch or it was probably the first space show that I realized was bad when I was watching it. And that's Space Precinct 2040, which was on in the early 19, it's just called Space Precinct, I think, actually, but it has like 2040 in
1994.
And so it was like a BBC / Jerry Anderson, I think I got that name right, production. And it's weird because the opening theme song sounds like RoboCop, but they're in space. And the whole plot is that you've got this veteran, grizzled New York cop who he's a detective, and he's been reassigned to a space precinct in orbit above a planet in the Epsilon Eridani system. Which, if that sounds familiar, that's where Vulcan is. It's in the Epsilon Eridani system, I think, if I got that right.
It's not real, Tariq. It's not real.
I know. I'm just saying.
Just say it.
You know, it's an actual star system, and it's just, the whole show is like, oh my God, I'm a New York cop, and my partner is also human, and the other, like the plucky icy female character is also human, but then they're on this station that are surrounded by alien cops
that have heads
chief.
that look like onions. Yeah,
you know, or they so every time, like one of the big selling points is that his whole family has to move to this space station, and everything is weird and nothing is normal because he's in an alien country, you know, an alien planet. So of course it's not normal, and it really does not hold up well because it's just all of his revulsion over all of these alien cultures, which I don't think is a good message for anyone these days. And it wasn't really what Star Trek was about. And that's what I'm holding it up to. Yeah. And the graphics are so awful for the time, because at the same time, you know, I was watching Star Trek and all of those other shows, and it just wasn't the same caliber at all. But you had a lot of model work, and they tout that in their big promo, which I have a link. I hope maybe that'll make it to the notes that people can watch, where it's like grizzled model work. It's really great, you know?
Oh. Well, and to that point, so Gary and Sylvia Anderson were the executive producers, who also did Space 1999, which came out in 1975, so way before Space Precinct. A better moment for them. So these are the people that brought us Fireball XL5 and Thunderbirds and all these British shows that use marionettes. Now, fortunately, Space 1999 and Space Precinct used actors for the most part. Space 1999 was a serious attempt to do serious science fiction with toy spaceships on strings. Interestingly, the effects were all done in what we used to call BiPAC, which is basically shooting a scene, backing up the film, shooting it again, backing up the film, shooting it again. So you could insert stuff without having to do visual effects compositing, but it made everything very kind of square feeling and truncated, because you can't have overlaps and things don't tend to do well in Z-axis flying. So the effects are a little wonky. You know, so the theme is there's this colony on the moon, station on the moon, and they have a radioactive fuel accident in the first episode, and there's a big explosion that throws the moon out of orbit and off to other worlds. And Isaac Asimov famously complained that explosion would, of course, wipe out the moon and probably part of the Earth. So it was kind of a funky premise up front. My primary recollection of this show, it starred Martin Landau and Barbara Bain of Mission Impossible fame shortly before that, is that they had these kind of beige, boring uniforms that were really silly looking, but primarily nobody ever smiled in this show. There wasn't one smiled in the show. So besides the horrible visual effects, sorry people who like the Eagle, and the kind of lame premise, just got re-released last year as a hero model, by the way. So yeah, and the Eagle was cool, but the show was such a downer. It wasn't dark and gritty in the way that Galactica was. It was just a downer because of all these really long, serious looks from these actors who would stare off the side of camera. And let's bear in mind, these shows we're talking about, for the most part, were done in the network TV era. So you had to have 4 or 5 acts, and you had to have the close-up moment before you broke for a commercial, and then came back to kind of a recap to get us back into the plot. So, you know, there were certain restrictions on them that modern streaming programming doesn't have. But man, it was just, for me anyway, a dreary trudge. I think you liked it better though, yeah?
I have the whole box set of Space 1999. So I inherited it. But and I have to admit, I have not watched the whole series. I have not watched the whole series. But, you know, I love the theme song. That really got me with all of the... it has like a disco vibe to it. They can get super actiony as it goes through. I love Martin Landau, a young Martin Landau, from some of the because I'd only experienced a lot of his work when he was older, right? And so I enjoyed it. There's like a weird alien that's kind of like a earlier like Spock incarnate too, but anyway, that comes in later on, but. I just, you know, it's worth checking out if you like ships and a really weird plot about the moon on its own, still being able to support a base on it, but
and yet always lit by the sun, no matter how far away it got. Interestingly,
that's right. So,
all right, well, let's go to our last and very worst of the worst. And disclaimer: I was the 4th and last visual effects producer on this pilot. The Joe Dante produced and directed Osiris Chronicles, a.k.a. Warlord Battle for the Galaxy, 1998. 1 episode only produced, thank God. Had some strong talent in it. John Corbett, Rod Taylor, John Piper Ferguson, who was probably the best of the 3, although Rod Taylor was great. Many years in the making. The reason I was the 4th visual effects supervisor is because the others either got fired or quit. And Gary Hutzel and I finished the show after we were working on Trek. And it's kind of a shame because it probably should have just been buried out in the Mojave Desert somewhere next to all the drug cartel bodies, because it really should have never made air. It was finally aired in
the ET Atari games. So.
Oh, man, God. So the basic plot element is solar systems was settled. Other star systems have been settled. People got restless and greedy. War broke out between the Galactic Republic and the Rebels. Rebels won. A dark age comes along, and Rod Taylor happens to be hiding a Galactic Republic starships off behind some planet somewhere. And John Corbett's sister gets kidnapped, and he's got to go after her. And he gets together with Rod Taylor, and they reactivate the ship. I think the most remarkable thing about it was the Osiris itself, the starship they have, which looked like a dolphin. It literally looked like a metal version of Flipper with little fins in the back that came out. I mean, everything about they were trying to go organic. I get that. Everything about it was wrong. It was ridiculous. So they get the starship to finance their venture. They steal some jewels from the warlord, who's really not a bad guy, but he wants his jewels back. So they start chasing him. And, you know, I freely admit the effects were pretty bad, although we did the best we could. It was way over budget. There were some interesting elements in it, but the show overall was just dreadful. And it was Joe Dante's low moment, and I guess the reason that he didn't continue on television. You haven't seen it, have you?
I guess not. I thought I recognized the name earlier when we were talking, but no, I've not seen this. And it's interesting that here it is in the TV guide. I've seen this TV guide when it was introduced, because it was the Sci-Fi and Fantasy issue, and I would always buy this for 1995, 96 is what it says that it's coming, and it's like a throwback to look, because you've got Hercules and Xena here, and the X-Files, whatever happened to the Star Trek stars, has got it's a picture of a youngish William Shatner, it looks like, on the cover, but no, same, like, it sounds like it was a what is it, a companion to Babylon 5 was on at that time, and Sliders, and looks like Jumanji had just come out back then. So if anyone's looking for a time capsule of other sci-fi and fantasy that was out, that's what we're looking at when Osiris Chronicles came out at this time.
Don't watch it. Leave me. Save yourself. All right. There are bits of it available on YouTube if you want to see how truly dreadful science fiction is made. This has been a pleasure, and I hope we get to do it again because we missed a number of shows
so
we wanted
much
to talk about, but there's only so much.
Burke just hinted at Farscape. Man, we totally didn't talk about that, which just transformed animatronics and puppetry on television for sci-fi. So man.
Because if you're going to do sci-fi, you might as well do sock puppets. So Tariq, before we go, where do we track what you're up to and what you're doing?
Well, you will find me this weekend watching Lightyear with my family, the new Buzz Lightyear. I guess it's like a prequel biopic kind of a thing that's coming out of Disney and Pixar. But other times you'll find me at space.com, and I'm on the Twitter at Tariq J. Malik. We'll have, I'll also be watching not one, but two more SpaceX launches. They got a triple header that they launched one just before we taped this episode here. There's two more in quick succession for the weekend. So I'll be watching all of that, and you'll see it all on space.com.
Very good. And if you want to know more about me, you can look at Ad Astra Magazine, which I edit at adastramagazine.com, my clever URL. My website is pylebooks.com, my other clever URL. In a few months, I'll be reappearing on William Shatner's Unexplained on the History Channel because you can't have too much William Shatner's Unexplained. Thanks for joining us for another episode of This Week in Space. As always, feel free, especially after this episode, to send us feedback at twis@twit.tv. That's twis@twit.tv. I can't wait for your comments. New episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe. Give us a review. As many stars as there are, punch the one to the right and tell your friends, because we want you to keep your friends. And hopefully, even if they hear this episode, they'll stay your friends. You can always head over to our website at twit.tv/TWIS, and we will see you next time.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed, with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit, and thanks for your support.